Days Without Art, December 24th, 2021, 3 a.m. A reading from Kitchen Table Wisdom by Rachel Naomi Remen, MD. The Will to Live. Can we choose to live? And if so, do we choose survival in the same way that we choose a suit of clothes or a car? Many people have come to believe that we do. Yet, evidence suggests that survival may not be chosen quite in the same way that we choose a possession. Life is not a possession. Those who intensely wish to live sometimes may die, and others, for whom life has little appeal, often linger on. How strange when many of us have an inner experience that there is some dimension of personal choice connected to survival. In these years of observing survival, I have come to wonder if there isn't a will accessed in dreams and imagery that is part of some basic encoding at the very center of our personal lives. Here, at that deep unconscious level, lies the drive to remain incarnate for purposes unknown to the conscious mind, a sort of commitment of our personal life force towards the particular and the concrete. Perhaps hidden in the present debate among personal choice and ultimate survival is an older, more mysterious concept, which has been called the will to live. If this is so, many factors on the unconscious level of things may affect this will, its strength, its coherence, and its tenacity. Our deepest and most unconscious beliefs about our own essential nature, our worthiness to live, may be operating here. Sometimes a kink in the will to live becomes more clear only when someone is challenged by significant illness. Max was the sort of man who lived close to the edge, smoking, drinking, fighting, driving fast cars. He was there wherever the edge was. At 63, he had been married 4 times and had made and lost 2 fortunes. At present, he was a successful cattle breeder. He sat in my office in a 10-gallon hat and batted boots, as uncomfortable and uneasy here as one of his own beloved champion bulls, penned up, too small. In response to my questions about his past, he told me he had grown up on a ranch in the Midwest. His father had been a cowboy, his mother the only daughter of the town banker. He had been close to his mother. His older brother, a robust and fearless child, had been close to their father. Their father had loved him, he said, and looked away. I looked at him sitting there, large and competent and reckless looking. His hands, resting on his denim knees, were scarred from a lifetime of outdoor work. They were a man's hands. When then did I have this stab of protectiveness, this fleeting sense of him as a frail little boy? Following this hunch, I asked him what he knew of his own birth and early childhood. He told me he had been born prematurely. For the first 2 or 3 years of his life, he was sickly and had absorbed a great deal of his mother's attention, worry, and time. His father's frustration had built until, in one violent argument with his mother, he had told her, "If that little runt was one of the animals, I'd have put it out to starve." I asked if he had overheard this or had been told about it by someone. He could not remember, he said, but he'd always known it, and he knew beyond doubt that it had happened. His father's resentment towards him had remained unchanged, even after he'd become big and made himself physically tough. He was not a forgiving man, he said. Sometimes his father would not speak to him or acknowledge his presence for weeks. acting as if he were not there at all. He never knew why. It had been so easy. It had been no easy childhood, and at 15, Max had left home. Annoyed with my questions, he asked me why all this was important. His foot was tapping and his eyes were restless. He patted his pockets absently. I wondered if he was yearning for a smoke. I told him that people's attitudes towards themselves sometimes made it easier or harder to recover their health, and so it was good to understand as much as we could. He began to talk about his half destructive tendencies. He told me that he had pushed death for as long as he could remember and described years of hard living and numerous injuries. Even as a child, he had been accident prone, and this had diverted even more of his mother's attention towards him and fed his father's resentment. He did not understand why this was so, as he was athletic and well coordinated. I always felt like I was no account, like I was no good. His many successes in business or in sports or with women had not eased these feelings, but just covered them over. Fooled them all, he said grimly. Perhaps, I said. It was hard to feel okay because you could never be sure what you needed to do to be okay. He looked at me puzzled. If you were supposed to live to please your mother or die to please your dad, I said. My remark shocked him. He had often wondered if he had lived recklessly in order to win his father's approval, or to prove himself the tougher man. This put a new spin on it. From the moment I was born, I was a real thorn in his side, just because I was there. Nothing I could do made a difference. He didn't want me, anyhow. I reminded him that despite his many brushes with death, his broken bones, the accidents, the risk he took almost daily, he was still here. I asked him what he thought had brought him through. Luck, he said quickly. I shot him a skeptical look. No one was that lucky. He sat for a while with his thoughts. Then, in a choked and almost inaudible voice, he told me that he himself had always wanted to live. I could hardly hear him. Can you say that any louder? He looked at the rug between his boots, unable to speak. He just nodded. Almost in a whisper, he said, I feel ashamed. My heart went out to him. In a shaking voice, he said, something in me wants to live. His eyes still fixed on the rug. Say it, Max, I thought. Say it until it becomes real. I wondered if I dared to push him a little further. Do you think you could look at me and tell me that? I asked him. I could sense the struggle in him. Had I gone too far? He had never confronted his father. Most likely saying such a simple thing out loud went against a lifelong pattern. Perhaps he would not be able to free himself even this little bit. With an effort, he raised his eyes, his voice still choked, but no longer inaudible. I want to live, he said evenly. We stared at each other for a few moments, but he did not drop his eyes. I smiled at him. I want you to live too. One way of looking at Max's history would be that the old argument between his parents had continued on in his unconscious mind. Confused and caught between his mother's commitment to his life and his father's wish that he disappear, he had ridden the fence between life and death all these years. Yet hidden through it was he himself held the tie-breaking vote. Perhaps the intensity of the inner dialogue had made it necessary for him to reassure himself of his choices by pushing it to the edge and casting his vote over and over again. Each time he had survived, he could feel once again his own wish to live. When the unconscious struggle is that intense, you might have to revisit the choice, often through accidents and dangerous living, just to be sure. Cancer was only the last in a long series of crises which put the question of his life to the test. It was why he was here. But now that he had cancer, it was going to be necessary to choose once and for all. Surviving life-threatening illness may require such a coherency between conscious and unconscious choice. Max had metastatic colon cancer. The experts had given him daunting statistics and offered only a guarded prognosis. Yet, expertise is not clairvoyance. As experts, we only deal with probability and not specific outcome. Like most people who do this sort of work, I have seen that the prognosis may not be the reality any more than the map is the territory or the blueprint, the building. Max lived for 8 years after this first meeting. We worked together for a few years, exploring the doorway that had opened in this first session, and I came to have a deep affection for this tough, funny, and very kind man. Gradually, he became able to understand and forgive both his parents and to value and care for himself. His injuries and his accidents stopped. In the first few months, he often joked about the moment when I cast my vote with him. Outnumbered the bastard once and for all, he would chuckle. When I told him that I wanted him to live, I spoke as a person to whom his life was important, and not as someone who knew what his outcome would be. Under their expertise, every physician feels this way about every patient, no matter what the odds. It is the motivation behind all that training, all that effort, the basis of all that commitment. I just think that sometimes it is important to say these sort of things out loud.